Hi guys, so back to 1984 today, and I'm going to read a few pages to you, and we're going to talk as we go along. We're in part 2, chapter 7, and the reason we're going to read it aloud here is because I know a few of you are well ahead of where we are with the lectures, and maybe even finished with the book. So in case it's been a while since you've read these pages, so what's going on? He's had his relationship with Julia going for a while now, and they've been meeting in that room above the shop. In chapter 6, so right before what I'm about to read, he finally met O'Brien. Remember that inner party member whom Winston thought he could detect a sympathetic expression on his face, and thinks he might be part of this conspiracy that's against the party. And so O'Brien gives him his address, and that's that. And at the end of chapter 6, Winston has a premonition of stepping into the grave, and he feels somehow that whatever he's doing, whatever O'Brien is, the ministry of love is waiting for him. And remember, they're not very loving at the ministry of love. So that's just happened. Now here's chapter 7, part 2, chapter 7. Winston had woken with his eyes full of tears. Julia rolled sleepily against him, murmuring something that might have been, "What's the matter?" So this is going to be a dream, and as you know, I'm interested in dreams when they come up in these novels. So let's see what his dream is like. "I dreamt," he began, and stopped short. "It was too complex to be put into words." That's a neat thing about dreams, right? You can't explain them very much because your mind is trying to tell you something that you don't have a grip on, you don't have a real handle on yet. So it's difficult to explain to yourself, let alone to another person. There was the dream itself, and there was a memory connected with it that had swum into his mind a few seconds after waking. So dream connected with some real event. He lay back with his eyes shut, still sodden in the atmosphere of the dream. It was a vast, luminous dream in which his whole life seemed to stretch out before him like a landscape on a summer evening after rain. Notice the word choice here. Calls water to mind, sodden in the atmosphere of the dream, summer rain. It had all occurred inside the glass paperweight, but the surface of the glass was the dome of the sky, and inside the dome everything was flooded with clear, soft light in which one could see into the interminable distances. Pardon me. Okay, so here's that paperweight again, which is shaped like a dome. And this is the language of like Genesis and the creation account, the dome of the sky and a flood, right? Like Noah's Ark. Again, track the water imagery. The dream had also been comprehended by, indeed, in some sense it had consisted in, a gesture of the arm made by his mother, and made again 30 years later by the Jewish woman he had seen on the news film, trying to shelter the small boy from the bullets before the helicopters blew them both to pieces. So remember, this is from a movie he saw that he mentions in the beginning of the novel. And it's a war film, and they show these graphic scenes of refugees on little boats being blown to bits by helicopters. So, there's water. Water again is in the background, and then this gesture of the arm. It's something like this, or even more, like a mother shielding her child. And he remembers seeing that in the horrible war film, and he's going to remember his mother doing that. So there's a memory tied with the dream. Okay, we're going to find out what that is. And keep in mind some of these symbolic associations water has. So water is what's there before creation, and again, if we're looking at Genesis, and it's got the breath of God moving over it. So it's also chaos out of which order is created. And water is the thing that floods the earth in Noah's episode. So it's and water's baptism, right? It's like destruction and rebirth both at the same time. I think it's significant that we're getting water imagery here. "Do you know," Winston said, "that until this moment I believed I had murdered my mother?" "Why did you murder her?" said Julia, almost asleep. "I didn't murder her, not physically. In the dream, he had remembered his last glimpse of his mother, and within a few moments of waking, the cluster of small events surrounding it had all come back. It was a memory that he must have deliberately pushed out of his consciousness over many years. He was not certain of the date, but he could not have been less than 10 years old, possibly 12 when it happened. Okay, so something like a repressed memory going on here, a traumatic repressed memory, and that's very Freudian. I'd prefer to think about things like that as it's a memory that he hasn't processed yet. He hasn't understood what it meant, what it means, which is why it's showing up in his dreams. His dreams are his subconscious mind trying to update him, trying to make sense of this thing that happened with his mother, 30 years ago. His father had disappeared some time earlier. How much earlier, he could not remember. He remembered better the rackety, uneasy circumstances of the time, the periodical panics about air raids and sheltering in tube stations, the piles of rubble everywhere, the unintelligible proclamations posted at street corners, the gangs of youths in shirts all the same color, the enormous queues outside the bakeries, the intermittent machine gun fire in the distance. Above all, the fact that there was never enough to eat. He remembered long afternoons spent with other boys and scrounging round dustbins and rubbish heaps, picking out the ribs of cabbage leaves, potato peelings, sometimes even scraps of stale bread crust, from which they carefully scraped away the cinders, and also in waiting for the passing of trucks which traveled over a certain route and were known to carry cattle feed, and which, when they jolted over the bad patches in the road, sometimes spilt a few fragments of oil cake. Bad times. When his father disappeared, his mother did not show any surprise or violent grief, but a sudden change came over her. And remember, disappeared means taken by the secret police, taken by the Ministry of Love. Could be dead, could be in a labor camp. No one knows. And then what happens is those people are wiped out from past, present, and future. They're not even spoken of anymore, like they never existed. His mother seemed to have become completely spiritless. It was evident even to Winston that she was waiting for something that she knew must happen. She did everything that was needed, cooked, washed, mended, made the bed, swept the floor, dusted the mantelpiece, always very slowly and with a curious lack of superfluous motion, like an artist's lay figure moving of its own accord. Her large, shapely body seemed to relapse naturally into stillness. For hours at a time she would sit almost immobile on the bed, nursing his young sister, a tiny, ailing, very silent child of 2 or 3, with a face made simian by thinness. Very occasionally she would take Winston in her arms and press him against her for a long time without saying anything. He was aware, in spite of his youthfulness and selfishness, that this was somehow connected with the never-mentioned thing that was about to happen. Premonitions of some nameless horrible thing in the future. Winston's had the same. He remembered the room where they lived, a dark, close-smelling room that seemed half filled by a bed with a white counterpane. There was a gas ring in the fender and a shelf where food was kept, and on the landing outside there was a brown earthenware sink common to several rooms. He remembered his mother's statuesque body bending over the gas ring to stir at something in the saucepan. Above all, he remembered his continuous hunger and the fierce, sordid battles at mealtimes. He would ask his mother naggingly, over and over again, why there was not more food. He would shout and storm at her. He even remembered the tones of his voice, which was beginning to break prematurely and sometimes boomed in a peculiar way. Or he would attempt a sniveling note of pathos in his efforts to get more than his share. Okay, so he was not such a nice little guy, although he's hungry, so you can understand why. But he's willing to bully his mother and his little baby sister out of their shares of the food because he's not got control over his animal appetites. His mother was quite ready to give him more than his share. She took it for granted that he, the boy, should have the biggest portion, but however much she gave him, he invariably demanded more. Good thing to keep in mind. At every meal, she would beseech him not to be selfish and to remember that his little sister was sick and also needed food. But it was no use. He would cry out with rage when she stopped ladling. He would try to wrench the saucepan and spoon out of her hands. He would grab bits from his sister's plate, stealing from his baby sister. He knew that he was starving the other two, but he could not help it. He even felt that he had a right to do it. The clamorous hunger in his belly seemed to justify him. Between meals, if his mother did not stand guard, he was constantly pilfering at the wretched store of food on the shelf. Okay, so that gives you a good picture of Winston as a child. And again, we're not going to do it today, but we're going to read some more from Solzhenitsyn, and that's a continual theme in the Gulag Archipelago, is just hunger that we can't even imagine living as we do in America in the 21st century, where we never have. It's not even that we don't have plenty to eat. We never have more than enough. We never have less than as much as we could possibly want and more. So it's hard to imagine the situation being described here. One day a chocolate ration was issued. There had been no such issue for weeks or months past. Now this looks back to the beginning of the book. Remember, a chocolate ration came up and Winston noticed it for some reason. So more on sort of subconscious mind stuff, things that are in the bottom of his mind, maybe, that his interest takes some places and he doesn't know why. And maybe it's because there's something about this memory he's having that he needs to process and that he needs to learn. He remembered quite clearly that precious little morsel of chocolate. It was a 2-ounce slab. They still talked about ounces in those days, between the three of them. Okay, so that's not very much for 3 people. It was obvious that it ought to be divided into 3 equal parts. Suddenly, as though he were listening to somebody else, Winston heard himself demanding in a loud, booming voice that he should be given the whole piece. His mother told him not to be greedy. There was a long, nagging argument that went round and round, with shouts, whines, tears, remonstrances, bargainings. His tiny sister, clinging to her mother with both hands, exactly like a baby monkey, sat looking over her shoulder at him with large, mournful eyes. In the end, his mother broke off 3/4 of the chocolate and gave it to Winston, giving the other quarter to his sister. So she goes without. The little girl took hold of it and looked at it dully, perhaps not knowing what it was. Winston stood watching her for a moment. Then, with a sudden, swift spring, he had snatched the piece of chocolate out of his sister's hand and was fleeing for the door. Winston, Winston, his mother called after him. Come back. Give your sister back her chocolate. So that's an ugly scene, right? He's got 3/4 of the ration in his own hands, and all he can see is the bit that his sister has that he doesn't have. Picture of envy, which has, it's got 2 sides. It's like a double-edged sword. One, there's sorrow that another has something good that you don't have. So it's a feeling of sorrow because of the good of another. And then the flip side is pleasure in another's pain. Schadenfreude is a good German word for that. Pleasure in someone else's sorrow or pain. So Winston starts in the first one there. So he starts by seeing his sister with the chocolate, envying it, even though he has more than her, and feeling sad because she has something good that doesn't belong to him. And then he takes it from her, and then he creates that sorrow to take pleasure in. And probably mainly sorrow for his mother, because the little girl's very young. He stopped, but he did not come back. His mother's anxious eyes were fixed on his face. Even now she was thinking about the thing, he did not know what it was, that was on the point of happening. His sister, conscious of having been robbed of something, had set up a feeble wail. His mother drew her arm around the child and pressed its face against her breast. So that's the gesture from the dream, right? That maternal protective gesture. Something in the gesture told him that his sister was dying. He turned and fled down the stairs with the chocolate growing sticky in his hand. Now, I want you to think about the gesture for a minute, because you have Winston's mother making it here. That's the last time he ever sees her. And what she's holding the baby sister, standing face to face with Winston. So protecting the child from him. And then where's the image? Where's the gesture recur? In that war film where it's a mother protecting her child from the helicopter that's about to shoot them all to pieces. And so there's a very uncomfortable association between Winston and that helicopter right here. And Winston knows it. And perhaps that's what his dream is trying to tell him. He never saw his mother again. After he had devoured the chocolate, he felt somewhat ashamed of himself and hung about in the streets for several hours until hunger drove him home. When he came back, his mother had disappeared. So he's got to ask, as an adult now, was that worth it? You know, getting that extra, what's a quarter of 2 ounces, that extra tiny portion of chocolate, and now never going to see mother or sister again. This was already becoming normal at that time. Nothing was gone from the room except his mother and sister. They had not taken any clothes, not even his mother's overcoat. To this day, he did not know with any certainty that his mother was dead. It was perfectly possible that she had merely been sent to a forced labor camp, and if you read Solzhenitsyn, that was almost equivalent to death. As for his sister, she might have been removed, like Winston himself, to one of the colonies for homeless children, reclamation centers they were called, which had grown up as a result of the Civil War. Or she might have been sent to the labor camp along with his mother, or simply left somewhere or other to die. The dream was still vivid in his mind, especially the enveloping, protecting gesture of the arm, in which its whole meaning seemed to be contained. Okay, the meaning of the dream is in that gesture. Let's see what happens and then try to unpack it. His mind went back to another dream of 2 months ago, exactly as his mother had sat on the dingy white quilted bed with the child clinging to her. So she had sat in the sunken ship, far underneath him and drowning deeper every minute, but still looking up at him through the darkening water. So that's earlier chapter. He told Julia the story of his mother's disappearance. Without opening her eyes, she rolled over and settled herself into a more comfortable position. I expect you were a beastly little swine in those days, she said indistinctly. All children are swine. Yes, but the real point of the story. From her breathing, it was evident that she was going off to sleep again. He would have liked to continue talking about his mother. He did not suppose, from what he could remember of her, that she had been an unusual woman, still less an unintelligent one. And yet she had possessed a kind of nobility, a kind of purity, simply because the standards that she obeyed were private ones. Okay, great. Nobility simply because the standards she obeyed, right? The convictions, the reasons for acting that she was beholden to were private. They were her own, not from the party, not from her neighbors, not borrowed. Her feelings were her own and could not be altered from outside. There's an idea of stoicism there, right? The ability to stay even in the face of both difficult and happy circumstances. To not be moved off your out of the condition of your soul, you could say. It would not have occurred to her that an action which is ineffectual thereby becomes meaningless. Okay, this is great. So this is the protective gesture. She's holding that child to her breast and wanting to protect it. Child's gonna die anyways. The woman in the raft in the war film holding the child, trying to shield it from the helicopter, they both die anyways. Winston's of the idea, and especially Julia, I'd say, is of the idea of the mind that if it doesn't do anything, gestures like that are meaningless. They don't mean anything. Winston's remembering that her mother would not even have considered that a possibility. An action which is ineffectual thereby becomes meaningless. If you loved someone, you loved him, and when you had nothing else to give, you still gave him love. When the last of the chocolate was gone, his mother had clasped the child in her arms. It was no use. It changed nothing. It did not produce more chocolate. It did not avert the child's death or her own, but it seemed natural to her to do it. The refugee woman in the boat had also covered the little boy with her arm, which was no more use against the bullets than a sheet of paper. Okay, we're building up to, I think this is a hard book to find hopeful passages in. It's pretty heavy, as you know, if you've finished it. But here's one of them, maybe the hopeful passage. And this is affirming the transcendent value of gestures like that, gestures made out of love and not out of this self-preserving fear that the party trains everyone to live by. And Winston, that's his creed, that's his credo, really. I mean, I know he's writing and being a little bit risky with Julie and stuff, but ultimately he cares about his own skin and nothing else. And he can't even bring himself to accept the idea that an act of rebellion or an act of defiance would be worth it unless it didn't someday produce some result. So let's say he'd be the opposite of a martyr. He's not someone who would die simply because it's the right thing to do. The terrible thing that the party had done was to persuade you that mere impulses, mere feelings were of no account, while at the same time robbing you of all power over the material world. When once you were in the grip of the party, what you felt or did not feel, what you did or refrained from doing, made literally no difference. Whatever happened, you vanished, and neither you nor your actions were ever heard of again. You were lifted clean out of the stream of history. And yet, to the people of only 2 generations ago, this would not have seemed all important, because they were not attempting to alter history. Here's the crux of this. They were governed by private loyalties, which they did not question. What mattered were individual relationships, and a completely helpless gesture, an embrace, a tear, a word spoken to a dying man could have value in itself. This is an affirmation of universal values, I think, and objective truth and real good and real evil. It's what's being said there is that the smallest actions done out of love are really worth something, and it doesn't matter whether people see it or know about it or whether it changes the world, alters history, as he says. And that's lost to Winston, right? But he remembers it from a generation ago. And so I think if there are models in this novel we can look at, because it's not Winston. Again, if you finish the book, you know it's not Winston. The protagonist is not someone to emulate. If there are models, it would be people like Winston's mother or that woman on the raft. And you might, the romantic interpreter in you would want to say, no, I need to identify with the survivor, with the hero, with the one who makes it, with the one who makes a difference. But it turns out that it's actually the ones who give their ego away, like the mother protecting your child, even though it's useless, but still willing to provide that comfort to the child in that last moment. It's those people are the models. Those are the ones we should be looking to. Not to the ones who hold on to themselves. And that makes it a difficult book to read, because most of the time we're in the head of someone who only lives for himself, right? And this goes back to, again, a theme in the Gospels. So for Matthew's Gospel, whoever would save his life is going to lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will save it, right? It's a paradox, but that's the gospel image of how you should live your life. And we're seeing the same thing via Negativa in 1984. So again, it doesn't seem on the surface hopeful, but as soon as you kill the romantic part of you that wants the individual self to win, then it's all of a sudden very hopeful. And we'll go from there.